Welcome back to American Republic. Last time we talked about the causes of the Great Depression, recognizing that some of those causes were issues of the times, but some of those causes are universal themes. Perhaps we can see some of those themes being applied to our lives today. Well, now let's talk about the conditions during the Great Depression. Americans lost confidence in the economy. They saw prosperity disappear. They had no hope that it would come back. One of the things that people did was that they did runs on the banks. What Americans tried doing was they tried to withdraw money from the banks. They feared that the money they had put in the banks would disappear. See, back in those days, if you had money in a bank and your bank closed, there was a possibility that you lost all of that money in the bank. So if that was a real fear, then people would rush to the banks to try to get their money out. Well, the problem is, the more that people rush to get their money out, the more likelihood that the bank would close, and then everyone else would lose their money. Within a 2-week period, over $1 billion had been withdrawn from banks around the U.S. Banks also ran out of money, and many of them were forced to close. The banks had loaned out money, and when they could not be repaid, the banks had no money and had to close. People who still had money in the bank, quote unquote, lost it all. By 1931, 4,000 banks had closed. Number 2. Another condition was unemployment. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. In fact, 1 in 4 workers were unemployed. Let's create that scenario and apply it to our classroom. We've got 29 students. We'll add me. We've got 30 people in our class in 8th grade history. Now imagine 1/4. That's about 8 of you. I know it's not exact math, but about 8 of you. Imagine all of a sudden your parents lost their jobs, had to quit the school, you couldn't come back. All of a sudden 1 in 4 workers had 0 income. Estimated numbers say that about 13 million Americans were out of work. Some workers kept their jobs but worked only a few days a week or a few hours a day. On average, 100,000 people a week lost their jobs. Conditions grew worse. As people bought less was produced. By 1932, the output of the country had fallen to 54% of what it had been in 1929. Some families took in renters. They planted gardens and canned vegetables to save on grocery bills. They patched clothing and wore hand-me-downs. Unemployed fathers and sons sometimes left home to search for work in other towns. Some lost their homes and were forced to move to shacks in neighborhoods that were nicknamed Hoovervilles. When a person could no longer afford his mortgage, his house was repossessed. The reason why they were called Hoovervilles was because the people blamed the president for the Depression. A little bit more about Hoovervilles. As the Depression deepened, Hoovervilles sprang up across the U.S. These poverty dwellings were usually located on the outskirts of major cities, where employment opportunities and services were greater. The homes in the Hoovervilles were built from anything the people could get their hands on. Tents, tar paper, boxwood, cardboard, car parts, spare lumber, and scrap metal were all used as building materials. Other terms to be used against Herbert Hoover. A Hoover flag was an empty pocket turned inside out, showing that one had no money. A Hoover blanket was an opened newspaper that a poor person used for cover as he slept. The Depression forced most Americans to lower their living standards. Being unemployed, many were forced to beg for handouts or find a meal at soup kitchens and bread lines. Those who had once been wealthy were gleaning fields or scavenging through city dumps or trash cans. A few men tried to escape from their troubles by jumping on freight trains to ride the rails as hobos. Number 3, more farm problems. Question, were farmers struggling in the 1920s? The answer is yes. They had produced so much food that the crop values remained low. If you look at page 435, you can see the commodity prices. In 1929, you could get a bushel of wheat for $1.05, but by 1932, it was down to 39 cents. Corn at 81 cents a bushel was down to 33 cents. You can see how all of that applied. So losing half or more of their income. Also, the Dust Bowl, which was caused by overuse of land and little rain on the Great Plains, brought extreme poverty to many farmers. First, the crops dried up. Next, the land turned to dust. Then winds whipped the rich topsoil off the dry, exposed ground. By 1933, black blizzards, as they were called, blew from west to east across the country. The clouds of dust darkened the skies as far away as Albany, New York. The soil drifted into banks like snow. Cars had to use their headlights in the daytime. Families put wet towels in windowsills and under doors to keep out the choking dust. Livestock left outside died of thirst. A little bit more about the dust storms. The dust storms that swept through the American plains during the Depression were both natural and man-made disasters. Soil erosion occurs naturally from the winds, but the farmers hastened the process. The wheat they grew replaced the grass of the plains, which had anchored the soil. When droughts came, the soil hardened, crumbled, and blew away in the wind. The walls of dust created by a dust storm sometimes reached heights of 2 miles and widths of 100 miles. Wind carried the dust at speeds of up to 50 miles per hour. When the dust clouds swept over, they blotted out the sun and covered houses and cars. The temperature dropped as much as 40 degrees, and the air was thick with static electricity. People got shocked if they touched anything metal. Some storms carried dust as far as cities on the East Coast. Even ships as far as 300 miles from the coast sometimes got dusted. So the Dust Bowl was a real, serious, dangerous time for our farmers in the 1920s, 1930s. In fact, many farmers gave up. Many farmers who left their homes to find work in California were nicknamed Okies. Many of them were called that because they came from Oklahoma, though not all of them were. Although California was not experiencing the Dust Bowl because so many people moved there, there was little work to find. So, a spiritual question needs to be asked, and we'll do our best to try to answer it. Question: was God judging America for the sinfulness of the 1920s? The answer? Maybe. One businessman wrote in 1930, "Business depressions are caused by dissipation, dishonesty, disobedience to God's will, a general collapse of moral character." So, was God judging America for the sinfulness in the 1920s? The answer is maybe he was. We know that God does have the power to judge nations. We also know that God does judge a nation that persists in its sin. So the next question that's asked is, did America turn back to God at this time? The answer? Sadly, no. Rather than returning back to God, like in times past, resulting in a revival, Americans will turn to the government to solve their problems. Honestly, it makes me think of the times we're dealing with right now, with the coronavirus going on. We're not able to go to school. a lot of your parents, a lot of people you know perhaps are unable to work because of coronavirus, because of what's going on right now. And people are really wondering what's going to happen. How will I be able to take care of things? Today, or last few days now, we've had the stimulus package to help out people to take care of some expenses. But is that going to be enough? Well, rather than relying on the government to take care of us, why haven't more Americans turned to God for support? I think the reason why is many people don't believe in God, and many Christians are what we'll term a practical Christian. What that means is they only worship God when it suits their interest. They only trust in God when they can already see the answer. We need to make sure that we trust in God even when our faith is tried. Well, the Americans of the 1930s will also trust the government to solve their problems. The man who's going to lead the charge to try to do this is the president himself, Herbert Hoover. Hoover's attempt to solve the problems. Herbert Hoover tried to remain optimistic, but few Americans listened. He believed that the Depression would be short if Americans remained calm and cool-headed. But they didn't, and runs on the bank increased, and stock prices continued to drop. Hoover will be given most of the blame as president. Now, is it fair for Hoover to be blamed for the Depression? I think no. If the government knew how to keep the economy from collapsing, it would have stopped it, right? Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and they get the blame for it. Number one, the veterans demand aid. The Bonus Army was a gathering in Washington, D.C., and these veterans of World War I demanded insurance money at an earlier date. They had been promised a bonus in 1945, but during the Depression, many veterans wanted the money now. As many as 20,000 veterans gathered to ask for this bonus. The government refused, and Hoover was forced to use the military to make them leave. When the Senate defeated the bill, Hoover was willing to pay for their trip home, but some veterans remained, and riots broke out with the police. Finally, Hoover sent in the military to stop the Bonus Army. After this event, Hoover received much criticism for treating the veterans harshly. See, Hoover had a theory. His theory believed in local responsibility to take care of local problems. He believed that the smartest and brightest in a community would know the best solutions for his neighbor. Rather than expecting big government from D.C. taking care of everyone, they thought local government, local people would help the local problems. Hoover also opposed doles. That means free handouts. Instead, he preferred giving money to public works projects. Rather than giving money to individuals like welfare, if the federal government gave loans to city governments, those city governments could hire workers to work on construction projects, thereby giving Americans jobs and using it for the public good. In 1931, construction started on what will later become known as Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. The government began construction of thousands of miles of roads to help out. Hoover also opposed government regulation of big business. He feared that if the government began to regulate business, it could lead to dictatorship, corruption, waste, and inefficiency. He also feared socialism, which believed that the government should control everything. A couple programs he created, there's Hoover Dam. A couple programs he created was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, loaned up to $2 billion to businesses and banks for projects to employ more men. That meant that there would be less need for direct relief. Hoover also set up a plan to give money to banks, loan associations, and insurance companies so they could aid homeowners who were having trouble making mortgage payments. They desired to keep the federal budget balanced. He was reluctant to spend large amounts of money for aid programs. 438 shows you a chart of government expenditures and receipts during this time period. And lastly, although basically good, his plans required time and cooperation from the people who wanted immediate relief. When that immediate relief failed to come, Hoover was criticized. For your homework, it's page 189 and 190 in your activities book. Have a good day. Be good, do good. Bye.